Well, we can move to question and answer. We have quite a crowd of questioners. We had a great model last night. The first question was brief, succinct. If you can emulate that, we would be pleased. So
I am the exact opposite of what you're looking for. I will be brief, but I don't know if I can be succinct. I just want to throw an idea out there and see if I get an interesting reaction from you. But the concepts of the morality and the ethical boundaries of humanitarian aid, I'm wondering if you just have any interesting thoughts on that. I raised all these funds through a church and went overseas as a missionary, then got there and distributed aid, but felt very uncomfortable with the ulterior motives that we often have. In my case, the end goal being conversion, maybe in your case, the end goal being our national interests. But I have always felt uncomfortable with mixing aid with an ulterior motive or another agenda, and I'm just wondering if that's been something that you've struggled with as well, and if you have helpful thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. But I, again, in my old age, I've come to admit to myself that we often have mixed motives for a lot of things that we do as human beings. I just think that's true, first of all. I think about Nigeria and our foreign assistance program in Nigeria. As a Christian, like Michael was saying earlier, this radical concept that every man, woman, and child, even in villages, even the lowest of the low, are created in God's image and are just as important in God's sight as those of us who sit around here in expensive suits. So as a Christian, and many of us are in the U.S., and we care about, therefore, the Nigerian villagers. So we want to have some assistance program that sort of helps lift them up, educate women or whatever. As a world citizen, getting back to the three identities, I think there's sort of the concept of human rights and universal declaration. And don't the Nigerian poor have rights to education and health care? As an American, there's another factor in Nigeria, oil. Okay? Now we import, I don't know what the latest figure, of all our imported oil, maybe 10% comes from Nigeria. If you throw in Angola and Equatorial Guinea, and it may get up towards 15%. And the percentage of oil we import from these African countries is growing as a percentage of oil we import. So what as an American, what we want, if we want more oil, is we want stability in Nigeria. And sometimes, at least in the short term, stability means more of a dictatorial, strong central government to maintain a control on the society. And so that all gets wrapped up together somehow. And it does bother me. It does.
Yeah, I think it can be difficult. But I guess I'd respond, I don't want to sound like a moral relativist, but in almost all of life, and including international relations, you're often balancing moral goods. It's not good and evil. There is a value to, democracy, human rights, the treatment of individuals, but there are certain circumstances where, if there were election in Saudi Arabia tomorrow, we'd have a worse circumstance than we do today. Whereas the stability in that circumstance, you have to work for long-term change. You have to try to prepare the way, where kind of destabilizing change could actually be detrimental. The United States has a few advantages in this area, at least from my perspective, and I know people are very cynical about this, but our interest is served by a stable international trading order, not by the humiliation of other countries. Our interest is served by the long-term stable growth of democratic institutions in other countries. This is, in fact, the long-term bipartisan commitment of American foreign policy, from Franklin Roosevelt to Truman to Kennedy to Reagan to the current president, is, the United States benefits from the growth of a more free, more stable, more, kind of open trade international order. And so a lot of our advances are not necessarily purchased at the expense of others. That's not been at least our recent history. So I think there are some congruence here. I look at, for example, the way we pursue foreign policy in Africa, which is different, for example, the way the Chinese pursue foreign policy in Africa. They have an entirely resource-based foreign policy right now, as far as I can tell. They're driven. They control 40% of the oil fields in Sudan. They have an increasing role in Nigeria. They prop up people like in Zimbabwe, dictators like in Zimbabwe. They've become the sponsors of the irresponsible in a lot of ways because they have a foreign policy that's just resource-based. This does nothing to deny the fact that there are very difficult choices to be made. You mentioned Egypt as an example, and it's very hard. I mean, we essentially provide assistance to Egypt right now as a payoff for Camp David. That's decades ago. Attempts to make it even a little more conditional on human rights and other treatment are resisted by the foreign policy establishment within the Bush administration, people on the Hill. I think that's a problem. I think that's a prime example of how aid, is not leveraged in ways that actually, encourage the right things. I mean, we've tolerated Ayman Noor, who I met in jail, diabetic in prison, for the crime of running for president, for much too long, and there clearly should have been more pressure on those areas. But we don't want the collapse of Egypt tomorrow either. So there are, and they're taken control by the Muslim Brotherhood, and so you have a tough. It's always a foreign policy. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean it's immoral, but it's often conducted on this slippery slope with competing moral priorities. So.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Charles Stromer from Knoxville, Tennessee. Thank you both for being here. This question is for Michael, kind of from out in left field, but indirectly related to today. So as a fellow writer and Christian, but not as someone who's ever written for the President of the United States, and given the flack you've taken lately on that, I'm not sure I ever want to. But I've had this on my mind for a long time, this process, and I wonder if you could give us some clues here. So like 20 or 30 years ago, as a Christian and up-and-coming writer, I had certain level of understanding of the faith and what I could quote-unquote get away with in my writing without thinking I was a heretic or something. But then I've gone through this process, as I'm sure you have over the years, where there was these turning point moments and experiences where I've changed and now 20 years ago I couldn't see myself at all writing what I'm writing now, but I am, and I feel good about it in my conscience and et cetera and so on. Could you give us some clues from your own personal experience of one or two turning points that you have experienced in the last 20, 30 years which allowed you to, get in the White House and write the way you did for the president with a clear conscience and willing to take this kind of flack and stuff? What sort of personal changes have you gone through between vis-a-vis as a writer, but as a Christian struggling with the faith and what you thought you could get away with and not become a heretic? To yourself,
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have to give some thoughts to the kind of anecdotal turning points. The reality is
to stretch people's thinking. So.
Yeah, the reality is that when you take that oath to defend the Constitution, and you become part of the American government, you do take on a different role in a certain way. I mean, I tried to kind of adopt a principled pluralism in that context. I think that given given our history, structure, form of government, I believe that public institutions can be welcoming to religious influence, can recognize their important role, but should never be sectarian, essentially to prefer one faith above another. And so that's a limiting factor when you're writing for the President of the United States. We would refer, as is a long history of America, to providence, to God's role in kind of in defining an ideal of justice that we pursue, of social justice that we pursue. But I tried to be very, very careful that it's not my role or purpose to push for Christian understandings of a variety of issues, and so I tried to keep these boundaries. Some of that I think came from working on the Hill and trying to understand, have some of it is a feeling of what's most effective in communications. So those were the kind of things that you weigh. I was perfectly willing to use cultural references from hymns or the Bible or other things like every American president has done. But that's very different from arguing from a specifically Christian basis on issues. Because it becomes a problem with kind of a violation of a principled pluralism. Clearly, we didn't get much credit for trying to respect those boundaries. We would often talk about, when we're talking about how the role of people of faith and people of no faith at all, we would always say, very often say. We would, the president was the first American president to use the word mosques in an inaugural address, out of this commitment to a kind of broad, inclusive pluralism. But that's very different than secularization, which says that in essence that religious ideals and language are off limits in public life. That's a different kind of question. So that was one of the struggles, that I went through to try to be true to the fact the president's own beliefs, my belief structure, which is definitely informed by my faith, but to argue, publicly in ways that were accessible and pluralistic. And you kind of that was part of what happened over time. So I don't know how responsive that is, but that's one of the things I struggled with.
Sure. Next question.
Good afternoon. I also lived overseas in Kenya and Tanzania for 8 years and currently a professor of missiology. And so my question, I'm very supportive of humanitarian endeavors, obviously. I was greatly disturbed by the they won't kill us if we help their children. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if our response in humanitarian veins, mixed motives or not, is sometimes manipulative. I lived with Kenyans who referred to the IMF as the International Mother and Father because it had strings attached and coercion that was a part of that. And I'd like for you to respond to the idea of, are we manipulative? This is our stereotypical image overseas. Oftentimes, how do we move beyond that, especially when we are actually saying statements like, they won't kill us if we help their kids? How do we move beyond that? How do we arrive at a true Christian humanitarian? As Americans, what is our identity, and how do we do that?
Well, of course, a Christian, like I'm on the board of World Vision, and World Vision is a Christian humanitarian organization. So World Vision has more freedom to express itself in Christian terms in its charitable work and development work overseas than the U.S. government is. But certainly all the large ones, including Samaritan's Purse, they didn't used to, but all of them use, even the Christian ones, all the big ones, use U.S. government and EU money to some extent. Some percentage of their budgets will be government money, and so the governments, as we've talked about today, are not their identity. They have different interests, and they're going to specify that the funds be used for a particular purpose, and the Christian organization has to use those funds for that purpose. It can use other ones that it gets from its donors for other purposes. I think we, there's been in the past, historically in the West, including us, the West meaning Europe and us, there has been manipulation, and we tend to think as Americans that we know what's best for everybody, don't we? I mean, we all do. We do. That's part of our traditions, and it has some good parts to it, but it gets a little skewed when you're dealing with developing countries. And so, the IMF and the World Bank and us and the EU, and we put all kinds of requirements on countries that are difficult for them to make, and we've been unrealistic in a lot of times, and we've been foolish, as I I think some of our Nordic brothers and sisters have with some more of their socialist emphasis in previous years. How we move beyond that, I don't know. I think, governments are governments, and they're always going to be, as we've tried to describe a little bit today, a mix of a whole lot of different, especially in a democracy like ours, a lot of different motives. And but for all the failures, there really have been, and there are some very significant sustainable successes in the developing world and the work that we've all done together. And I just have to end the day to be able to sleep at night. I have to think of those successes because they're real and they are sustainable, and people are living better and are able to take care of themselves more and more each year. If we can just keep civil order. I mean, once fighting breaks out, look at Afghanistan. I mean, with as long as there's fighting, you can't. There can be no real. I mean, we're doing some education of girls and some things, but it's really hard when the war is going on.
I guess I would only add, I don't believe, having been in government, that there's anything essentially dirty about the national interest. I think for promoting hope, economic development, human dignity as an alternative to ideologies that take advantage of resentment and bitterness, I don't have any problem with that at all. I think that, in fact, that's an appropriate use of public money to serve the American people, which is the president's responsibility. And I don't think it's a zero-sum game in which you're somehow humiliating or undermining the people you're trying to help. I don't think it's necessary that that's the case. But I will say that there's been a certain kind of aid done in history that has been paternalistic. There's absolutely no question. That, by the way, is the whole theory behind the Millennium Challenge approach, is to try to pursue partnerships instead of paternalism in these circumstances, to elicit, genuine, on-the-ground input on what the real needs are. And often those needs are things like rule of law and women's rights and basic infrastructure and those sort of things. That's what this money is being spent on. But I guess I don't know by what moral theory it would be problematic that those things would accrue to the benefit of the people who make the donations, which are the American people. And under those circumstances, I think they would expect both that it not be wasted, and secondly that we're pursuing a world that's more peaceful, less oriented towards hostility towards American citizens, is not producing ideologies and individuals that kill our citizens. So that seems to me part of the essential role and the biblical role of what government should do, is to pursue a kind of an order, a just and progressive and economically advancing order that where individuals turn their energies towards trade and participation and democracy and self-government, instead of are embittered and turn to ideologies of hatred and violence.
Thanks. Next question, sir.
Good afternoon. My question was very similar to the one previously, but how, if as Christians we're called to act justly and to love mercy, what do you think is the role of government and also as Christian citizens in how we advocate, considering the kind of the current events in the world taking place today, the kind of resistance on and taking into consideration the trade agreements that are going on and this especially from the global south on like the dissatisfaction of a lot of the trade agreements. How do you think as Christians, people of the church, can take part to advocate for a more just, and what is your definition of a just, if you look at it as from a biblical perspective and from a government's perspective, what is just when there could be an inconsistency in humanitarian aid and trade policy?
My goodness. Yeah.
Big question.
That's good. Yeah, good for you. We'll talk about it the rest of the day. I've got a flight to catch. Yeah, what is just? I mean, the thing is, you were asking the question, what comes to my mind is the cotton farmers in Mali Apparently they grow Mali's in West Africa, Northwest Africa. I think it's mostly Muslim, and neither here nor there. But they apparently, they do a good job. They're good farmers. They grow good cotton. And it's frustrating to me. I grew up in a cotton area, and I know guys that grow cotton today, and it's frustrating to seem somehow, if there's justice in the world, the guys in Mali who work their buns off and are trying to support their kids and are trying to do all the right things and are not, they're not killing people and they're not advocating terrible things and they just want to support their families and they want to work hard. Aren't those American values too? They can't sell their cotton because of certain trade restraints. But I know it gets real complicated, and there's maybe agricultural economics involved. There's also domestic politics involved, and the Farm Bill is involved, and all. But it is frustrating that we, and I think we Christians need to think about these things. We need to think about the World Trade Organization. We need to inform ourselves. Get on the websites. It's easier these days to learn about, because trade, sometimes they say trade, not aid, but it's trade and aid. We need to educate health, clean water, and that kind of thing in developing countries, but also trade. People and Michael said in visiting Africa. People are hard workers. People the world over really pretty much want the same things, and they want to be left alone, and they want to be able to work hard, and they want to have some result of that for their children. That's really what we all want, and that's really what I see all over the developing world. And so to the extent that trade agreements to which we're a party with the others inhibit people from being able to do that, I think that's unjust.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you look at, trade has been the instrument by which more people have been brought out of poverty at the same time, more than any other thing in history. If you look at Asia, you look at a lot of other places, it can have an extraordinary effect in alleviating poverty under the right circumstances. But clearly, there can also be elements of exploitation there that have to be confronted. But I agree. I think the main obstacle when you look at Africa and other places is not so much, that trade itself exploits. The main obstacle is that Europe and the United States close their markets in key areas to support our own farmers and other producers in ways that don't allow developed people in the developing world to compete. There have been some progress in those areas, and the Europeans and the United States are both guilty in a lot of ways in that case, particularly on the agriculture side. I would like to see a situation where you have no agricultural supports or barriers. I think that would be one of the best things we could do for the poor of the world, and the estimates are dramatic, and there are millions of people that could be taken out of poverty. But it's one of the toughest things on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And the constituency doesn't really exist right now.
Yeah. And agricultural trade subsidies doesn't really make the best bumper sticker or church mobilization campaign. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. I think what we'll do is take all of these questions that are standing up, and if we can take them all together and then give our guests the time to explore all of them in the remaining time. Thanks.
My question, I think, may have been slightly addressed before, but I'm going to reframe it just a little bit. With the phrase that people won't kill us if we save their children, what can the U.S. government do if they don't care about their children? Like in a situation such as Mugabe in Zimbabwe, what can we do if we sit back and we don't necessarily have any trade interests or security interests with Zimbabwe, and we could proactively get involved? He's obviously not caring. So what can the U.S. government do in a situation like that? Is it just left up to the private charities or to the Danes?
Thanks. We'll take them all together.
Good evening. My question is a little bit primitive, and I need to preface it with the fact that I'm an alien in this country, legal alien, and I don't, and I do not vote in this country, so I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. But I have noticed that often going back to Europe, I have to be standing up for America, and especially your president. it's simply a fact that he's the most demonized person probably on the face of the earth at the moment. And I was just wondering, is his failure, or what we perceive as his failure, more caused by his Christian belief, as he's also an evangelical president, or is it caused by American values? What is the nature of that failure? And at the same time, is there anything redeemable you can say about his presidency, his beliefs represented in his presidency, and so forth? Thank you.
Thanks. So we just get one easy question after another.
Yeah.
Hi. Good morning. Afternoon. My question is for Ambassador Anderson. I wanted to know if you agree or disagree with the statement that the American government ought not give humanitarian aid to entities that might use it discriminatorily based on race, religion, or sex.
Again, thank you for your time this afternoon. I was just wondering, for both of you, what individuals, models, or readings personally influenced your perspective on humanitarian aid?
Who would like to begin?
Let me start really briefly with Zimbabwe, which is an issue that I've been involved in. I mean, that is a case where America has few levers, and you have a deeply irresponsible government. But the reality there is there are often levers even if we don't have them. And this is a case where the South Africans have a huge amount of leverage, given trade and history and other things with Zimbabwe, which I believe if they were to use more effectively and aggressively, that it would it could make a big difference in a small amount of time. I have a good friend who's a member of the Zimbabwean Parliament, an evangelical and human rights lawyer, who says that if the South Africans were to even threaten a trade embargo or to be more active, that he didn't believe that Mugabe's government could last for weeks. And so, I wish that the United States government were doing more on that to pressure the South Africans. I wish that South Africa and other surrounding African countries. There's an unfortunate tendency I've seen for African countries to say, I'm not going to judge the internal affairs of our neighbors because they don't want to be judged themselves. But this is a case where the level of oppression and the complete destruction of the economy and the growth of hunger and the massive political crackdown really would justify, I think, some more urgency. And I don't think either America or Zimbabwe's neighbors are particularly helpless in that circumstance. So, you want to take
Yeah, I agree, Michael. That I think it's the neighbors, and because the whole colonial history of Africa, it's still very, very real, especially to people in their 50s and 60s. And that's a real sensitive subject for African leaders, is their colonial past. And so for them, when we and the Brits condemn Robert Mugabe, he was a great freedom fighter and he led his people and all that, kind of the Moses of his people. And so when we condemn him, it just doesn't work. We have to, but we don't have any levers really, and so there's still a lot of food aid and whatnot. Like I know World Vision has a big office in Zimbabwe, and food aid gets there. But it's going to have to be the neighbors. I agree totally, but I'm skeptical about them doing. I mean, good heavens, it's been so long, and you're kind of ready for them. It sounds paternalistic, and it probably is, but there needs to be a leadership maturing. In any place, and in Africa, they're just not ready to condemn, one another. It's just really hard to do. And as Michael said, if I condemn you, or I, then I'm going to get it the next day, and so they just leave each other alone. But we hope they would work it out sort of behind the scenes, but they haven't done it.
Yeah, and it's the reason that it's a good thing to have stronger regional organizations, the AU and others, to kind of take a more active role in these things, because we often, because of that colonial history and it's hard to have outside pressure in these circumstances. You need local leadership. AU took more leadership than they have before in Darfur and troops and other things. But Zimbabwe's been a real problem.
Would you like to take the easy question about President Bush?
Yeah, no, I won't. It would be a long response. I mean, so much of it is related to Iraq. The reality of that circumstance, which has been, unexpectedly difficult and hard on America's image in the world. If you look at the global, I would respond in a couple of ways. One of them is that I think we've passed some of that in Europe. The circumstances actually much improved. I don't know about the average voter, but they're not voting voting on the issue of anti-Americanism in ways that some might have predicted, both with Sarkozy and with Merkel. So you have both France and Germany, who were the primary problem now, with people that are significantly more open to America's role and leadership on these questions, and are working quite closely on issues like Iran, where we have very strong ties to the Europeans in trying to resolve that circumstance. So from a diplomatic perspective, maybe not a public opinion perspective, things are significantly improved. I would also say that, I don't want to sound too harsh about it, there are bad reasons that America, from my perspective, is unpopular in certain parts of the world. Abu Ghraib was one of my worst days at the White House, and it undid a lot of good things that we attempted to do on the democracy agenda in the Arab world in particular, and that's just a fact. I mean, I feel the same way increasingly about Guantanamo. I think that it's become a symbol, an unfortunate symbol for America in the world, undermines our public diplomacy, and there are ways to close Guantanamo that are consistent with our security. So those are things that should change. I also believe that America could probably be doing more on climate and carbon in particular, and I've argued that I think would probably gain significant support in the world. But when you look at the polling, there's also a significant portion of the polling, of hatred for America is related to hatred for Israel. It's a fact that a significant portion of particularly Middle Eastern opinion, would prefer to see Israel not exist. And that's not a policy change that America is going to make under a Democrat or a Republican, and it's a bad reason to try to curry the favor of the world. If you look at the world opinion, they also, overwhelmingly want the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan, which I think would be a foreign policy disaster, and the Afghans themselves would certainly just be shocked and horrified at that prospect. That would be a bad thing for America to do, to try to please the world in a certain way. So you have to make you have to weigh what are the things that the problems we can and should solve as far as American public image, and what are those things that we have to live with because of our commitments in the world and the nature of our friends and the pursuit of our own interests.
And the last question about withholding aid, in a sense, punishing citizens for the discriminatory policies of their governments. Should the U.S. withhold aid from governments that don't distribute?
Yeah, that's like all of them. That's a hard question. In Kosovo, which in a Muslim village after the bombing campaign expelled the Serb military, USAID had a plan where we would bring the leaders of the villages in Kosovo together, and we would hear from them what their needs were. We wouldn't just run in and build a well or whatever. What are your needs? You want to do the school first, or the road, or whatever, the brick factory. So the first few villages, when our guys, I wasn't there, but our people had the meetings. All people showed up. There were no women. We forgot to say, oh yeah, the other half of your population. And so our people said, okay, this ain't going to happen. You go back and get some women leaders here because we want to hear also what they say. And of course, the Kosovar Muslims said, oh, no, we know what they want. And they speak through us. Okay, so that was a case of their local culture in operation, traditional male dominance and leadership in the village life. coming, head up against a young 28-year-old idealistic USAID Foreign Service officer who was insisting that, no, we don't discriminate. We want to know what women feel because their interests may be a little different. It may be a water well because they're the ones that got to go get it, not you guys, if there isn't any water. So it gets real hard because we try not to be, at the same time, as we've said, paternalistic. And say, okay, every culture, cultures in the world are different. People have all kinds of different values. We have ours. We try to convey what ours are. And one often is the role of women. That's often an issue. And we try to convey that in every way that we can, and have Secretary Rice and Secretary Albright just in existence is somewhat an expression of our values. But it gets real hard. It's hard to withhold it if they're not going to follow every rule that we lay down. But some things we won't compromise on when we know about it. We sure would never, hopefully never eliminate, like say, an ethnic group because they were discriminated against. I mean, that would just be, it goes against every. So we're Americans. We have sort of all these values we've been talking about today. And when they implement the aid programs in these countries, sometimes those values do clash. And locally, we try to work it out, but sometimes it doesn't work so well.
I'd only add to that an AIDS policy, for example, the kind of African approach is called ABC. It's abstinence, be faithful, consistent, appropriate condom use. And you find everywhere you go, one of the most consistent themes is that neither A nor B nor C work when women have no power in a relationship. And so there are direct public health effects on these issues, particularly as it relates to women's rights. And it does present that tension. I mean, we attempt to promote girls' education because it's often the alternative to prostitution and a lot of other problems. Women's legal changes to protect women. I mean, to enforce laws against rape. Right. To have prosecutors and family courts, which across much of Africa don't exist.
Inheritance.
Right. And then economic empowerment too. I mean, particularly small business kind of approaches. So I mean, those are kind of ways rather than condemning cultures in these things that you can try to affect policy changes that are favorable to the rights of women. But it's often a real tension.
Yeah. Like female genital mutilation is one terrible thing we all just abhorrent. But you just can't go into a place. Okay, you're not going to do that anymore. It doesn't work. It's too embedded. It has all kinds of history and culture around it. But teaching young girls to read and write, other sort of democratic institution building in the country, these things may take a generation. For some people, it's not quick enough. I mean, I wish we could eliminate female genital mutilation just boom tomorrow. And sometimes the state will pass a law and say it's against the law, but nothing changes. It takes time.
Well, we've barely scratched the surface, I feel, on so many of these themes, and I'm very grateful for the ways in which you have brought light and understanding, wisdom, experience to bear on these issues, how we juggle our global, heavenly, and national citizenships, particularly in the humanitarian sphere. And I would ask you to join me in thanking our guests for their wonderful presentation. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. All that remains for me to do is to thank you. You can sit if you wish. This is, as I said earlier, is a conversation we want to keep throughout this coming year. We are holding Global Leadership Forum 2008 next year on faith and foreign policy. Between now and then, we want to keep this sort of conversation alive. So please take that sign-up sheet from your brochures, and if you're interested in participating in an ongoing discussion throughout the year or hosting one, please indicate so on that sign-up sheet and drop it in the basket at the back. Please also fill out your evaluation sheet. We wanted to remind you that this church is a working church. There's a church service tonight here at 5:30, which you're all welcome to attend. I would encourage you, and especially if you're interested in a church that thinks and prays about issues like the ones you've seen treated here yesterday and today. We invite you to continue your conversation in the hall. The church actually has to use this space as soon as we're done to get ready for their service. So please keep the conversation going. Please keep the networking going, but do it in the lobby or in the great room. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being part of this discussion. We are incredibly grateful to Fairfax Community Church. I want to single out, and she's probably not here, but her name deserves mentioning. Valerie Dixon is the brains behind the operation. Are you there? All right, stand up, Valerie. We have to. If you've been fed properly and organized and put in your seats at the right time, everything that went well is Valerie's doing. Everything that went badly is my doing. So you can speak to me afterwards. So thanks again for coming, and please continue the conversation. Keep in touch. Check globalchristian.org as well to keep up the conversation. Thanks so much.